All right, welcome to the Money podcast, where we talk about money and movies. Today, our guest, we have former U.S. Army Apache helicopter pilot who became a real estate note investor and entrepreneur. Please welcome Kevin Stokes. Kevin, super happy to have you on our show.
Yeah, this is great, Ryan. It's nice to be here.
Yeah, so Kevin is officially my first guest that isn't in the visual effects, animation, or gaming industry. And so this will be a nice breath of fresh air, I'm sure, for everybody, because now we get a outside opinion. But to that point, there is a tie-in here that we're going to talk about here shortly. But Kevin and I met in a business accountability group through Tom Woods School of Life, and we got to talking, and we have a lot of common interests, including film, and got to know each other a little bit more. And so I thought I'd have him on because you can't talk to Kevin without getting super excited. The first time I saw him in that accountability group, everybody in the room was super jazzed. And we'll talk about that as well later, about when you came back into the accountability group. But first, before we get into all that, why don't we talk about a little bit about your background, and then specifically that story that you told me where you worked on a film set when you were in the military.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. So I appreciate the introduction, and that's pretty kind of you. So, yeah, so my background, Idaho native. I was in the Idaho National Guard right at the tail end of the 90s is when I joined, and I ended up being selected for flight school after a couple of years enlisted and became an Apache pilot. We deployed to Afghanistan as a unit, spent a year over there. That was pretty fun. Came back to the States and started progressing through my career. I ended up becoming an instructor pilot. I was also a safety officer, and then filled in on the very last maintenance test pilot course that the Army conducted for the Alpha model Apache that was flying in. And along the way, I became a full-time guy out at the maintenance hangar as the assistant facility safety officer. And one day, the Idaho Guard was called by the national Guard recruiting office and said, "Hey, we're shooting a commercial in California. We had some Apaches from the Utah Guard that were going to be on set, but they have an issue that had occurred at their unit, so we need Idaho to fill in." And so I didn't get selected on that first test, but some other friends of mine went, and I was very disappointed because I was probably the largest, vocally anyway, movie buff or movie fan out of the pilots that I knew. And I was kind of jealous of the fact that these guys got to go and work with Anton Fuqua and his production staff on a Three Doors Down music video. And we did really well as a unit. It was a very exciting experience. Those guys talked about it to no end, and recruiting really liked working with the Idaho Guard because we were so close and we were so fast to get there. And then the very next year, they signed an agreement with Dale Earnhardt Jr. and Kid Rock. And so they decided to film another one. They called up Idaho, and this time I made sure that I got to go. So I was down in Los Angeles with the rest of the guys from our battalion that went. We had a bunch of crew chiefs, our aircraft, two of our aircraft from Idaho, and the California National Guard had some Blackhawks, and we got to go to the Blue Cloud Movie Ranch up there in Santa Clarita, just north of the valley. And that was a phenomenally cool experience. Didn't get to see Kid Rock or Dale Earnhardt, but all the film buffs would love this. I got to work with the assistant AD was Jimmy LaRocca. He had just finished Aces up there in Tahoe, and I loved that movie. That was a lot of fun. That film was pretty enjoyable, so I was kind of excited. I was probably the only person in the entire National Guard that was there that even knew who he was. And so that was kind of fun, and it made me a nerd. And most of the rest of the pilots were making fun of me for the most part. And we started having some communication difficulties with the ground crew, and the pilots, being the type of personalities that they are, don't like really being told what to do by people that don't know what's going on in the aircraft. And of course, didn't understand what the film crews were doing. And so I ended up having a meeting with Jimmy and saying, "Hey," because we were about to get fired, because the director on that project was James Mangold. And he was getting pretty upset because that guy has a very demanding level of skill and expectation and expertise that's pretty phenomenal. And of course, I'm standing there looking, and I see his director of photography is freaking Wally Pfister. And this is fresh after Dark Knight, and so I knew who all these people were, and I was having a hard time keeping it together and not slipping into some hero worship here, just because I knew who these people were. I loved all the projects that they had been involved in, at least in the recent past. And so, at any rate, I had a meeting with Milaroka, and we were getting ready to fire. He didn't even want to talk to me. I just started asking him questions, and he could tell that I actually cared. And within a couple of minutes of discussing with him, I kind of understood what they were looking for. So I went back to the air crews, and we were on break, and everybody was pissed. They wanted to leave. The film crew wanted us to leave. And I said, look, this is what they want. This is how we're going to do it. I took lead of the flight, and we were just flying down the middle of the set. And there was going to be some soft explosions on the ground, blowing up dust in the air, and the ground actors, who were all National Guard soldiers, were doing pretend room clearing and door entry, and we would fly over. And after the very first take, now mind you, we had spent an entire day, millions of dollars,
right,
in production costs,
right,
just to get to this point where everybody's mad at us. And in the very first shot, they decided on accident, it was supposed to be rehearsal. They just decided to roll the cameras, and we got it on the first take.
Nice.
And they were ecstatic. They were all yelling on, like you'd think we were in combat or something. They were so excited. It was pretty funny on the radio. So we take off, and then after that, we had like 5 more takes that they took because the ground guys had missed one piece. Like one guy fell down or something. And anyway, so it became like tedious to the film crew because the aircraft were on time in the perfect spot every time, and they were just beside themselves. And so then we'd add one more scene after that. And of course, we'd been there for 2 days, hours and hours of work. And of course, 30 seconds into the music video, I'm on screen for about 1 second, and then about half a second, not maybe 2 or 3 seconds later. And that was it. That was the only time we were on camera.
Nice.
So,
but
it was fun
to experience that whole thing, which is really cool.
Yeah, it was mind blowing. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it's funny because prior to that, I being a history buff, there's a couple of crew chiefs I became really good friends with while we were in Afghanistan. And we were on the deployment right after Marcus Luttrell and the Navy SEALs had all their trouble just kind of off to the east of the Korengal Valley, where the book Lone Survivor was set. And I actually had pictures. We've flown so many missions, and I took a camera, and I took video cameras, and I took some photographs of what I think is the village that he was in. I'm not exactly sure because I wasn't GPSing the pictures, but I sort of correlated the map and the book and other things I've seen since then. And I got really excited because we were still in country when that book came out, and I read I borrowed somebody's copy, and I had read like just one or two chapters of it, and I had to give the book back to him. And then we ended up back in the States, and one of the crew chiefs and I are good friends. We started hounding like the Idaho Film Office. We started talking to all the different people that we knew there's a lot of people that work in Hollywood, at least back then, that lived in Idaho and then would commute to California or to New Mexico for their productions. And we started just trying to beat the doors and try to get involved somehow. We didn't know what we were going to do. Along the way, Peter Berg picked up the rights to the book. And we had started emailing his Film 44 production company. And when I say email, it was like every week I sent an email, and then Kent would send an email, and like we were relentless. And eventually we got in contact with Sarah Aubrey, his executive producer. And when we were down there at the Blue Cloud Movie Ranch, we snagged a meeting with her, and we drove over to their office on the net because we finished the set, our scenes so early after that second day. They just said, go do what you want. You guys are here for the next 3 or 4 days. So we drove down to their offices. I don't even remember where they were at now. There's quite a ways. It was the first time I'd ever driven in LA. So that was an eye opener anyway. We sat with her. We met with her. We kind of talked to their production staff. I showed them a bunch of the pictures that I took, some pictures that Kent took. And like, it really started some discussion of trying to get a location. But once they picked up Wahlberg, the production really started getting its funding, and they ended up bagging Idaho because Idaho at that time didn't have the production capability to really pull it off. It would have been a little austere. Should have been easier to go to Afghanistan and film on location, probably, at least in those days.
Right.
And so at any rate, I mean, it was fun. It was a pretty good, cool adventure, and got me like a lot of exposure to the film business that took me from being sort of a peripheral nerd fan to
actually
someone who
seeing
was
it in
addicted. Yeah.
yeah, that's
Yeah,
really
it was
cool.
pretty cool.
That's
Yeah, it
awesome.
was pretty fun.
When you went from all of that excitement, how long after did you leave the military and then you decided I'm gonna become an entrepreneur? Was there a big gap in time or
Well,
what?
let's see. So when I was in Afghanistan was 06. Got home in February of 07.
Mm,
And the whole unit did.
so
And
so right around the financial crisis and when
oh
all
yeah, I
that
was
was going
completely
down.
oblivious to it at first because my brain was somewhere else, right?
Mm,
And gosh, it would have been, I want to say it was 2000, late 2007 was the Three Doors Down video that we participated in, our unit.
mm, mm-hmm.
And then I think it was the spring of 2008. Might have been summer. I can't remember. It might have been like May or June or something that we ended up down in Los Angeles for the Kid Rock video.
Gotcha.
And I was a part-time soldier before. And in aviation there's a lot of need for full-time jobs, and I was selected for the assistant safety manager job not maybe 2 or 3 months after the video shoot.
Mm-hmm.
And that put me in a full-time position. That put me on a 3-year contract. And in that 3 years was when I went from just being a pilot in command to an instructor pilot, and almost simultaneously was selected for filling in because they were short a student at the maintenance test pilot course. And I was home from the schoolhouse probably, I think, 2 weeks. And
Mm-hmm.
then they said, you're going right back to the schoolhouse to go to the maintenance test pilot course. And I did well at that, but just because I was in a schoolhouse mindset. And so then once that started, I did 2 more years, but it was in that 2-year period that the job changed. At the same time, I had used my VA money to buy my first rental property. It was a duplex. I lived in one side and rented out the other.
Uh-huh.
And I then met my now wife. She's my girlfriend at the time. She saw what I was doing, thought that was a really good idea. She used her FHA, first time homebuyer, um, benefits to buy her first property as a duplex.
Right.
And so we did that for like, I want to say like like a year. And we decided to get married, and our unit was selected we got the schedule that came out. We were selected to go to from the Alpha model Apache to the Delta model Apache. And because I was qualified in a number of schools, I would have had to gone to the A to D transition course, and then the instructor pilot course, and perhaps the maintenance test pilot course. In addition to that, our unit was slated to go back to Afghanistan in 2014. And because of the individual train up, the unit train up, the deployment train up, and the deployment, I was sitting looking at a 4.5-year window, and I would be home about 8 months of that time, and not all at
Wow.
once.
Right.
And for somebody who was in the National Guard that was just doing it part-time, and really, I mean, I really loved it, but I was in a new relationship and we were getting pretty serious, and decided that maybe we should explore new paths.
Right.
And we ended up deciding, okay, well, I'm going to need to make up for that income. And so
Mm-hmm.
if we leave, maybe I'll go to a part-time status. We debated all this stuff. And I just decided that I had enough time in front of me before I could even contemplate wanting to get out for retirement or any of those sort of things. So we just did the calculus and said, okay, it's time to get out. And we decided to get out, and we decided to go on this little tour of, we'd buy a house. So we kept our duplexes, and we'd buy a house and we'd fix it while we were living there, and then sell it, and then just move on. We just did that a number of times.
You did that
And
all
it was,
in Idaho, or was that
yeah,
in
all in
other
Boise
states?
where we live. Yeah,
Yeah.
we were all here. We didn't do anything outside of the valley. If we couldn't drive to it, we wouldn't even contemplate it.
Right.
And then I went back to college. I got a degree in IT, got an IT job. My wife had her job. We started having kids, and then rentals were too much, and we were just like, "No, we got to do something different from that too." And then we transitioned out of rentals into other
Into
parts of real estate, and the real estate notes, and like seller financing, that sort of stuff. And I know we'll talk about getting into that, but that's the story of how that transition.
Gotcha.
And that was from, yeah, I got out in, let's see, January of 2012.
Okay. Well, that is actually a really good transition to the mortgage notes because um, that I think is a mystery to many people, including myself. I've looked at it and I sort of get it, but I would love to like bird's eye view what exactly is involved there and how, because you think most people think of mortgage notes, well, that's just a bank deals with that. They don't realize that, people can get involved in that. So could you kind of explain what those investments are and how that's even possible? A non-bank person to do
Yeah,
that.
it's fascinating because I grew up on a farm, and it's very common for people to seller finance agriculture.
Mm,
If people are not buying a piece of a ground that's zoned to agriculture for some sort of development where they'd have a lot of money or investors, right? Those guys can go buy cash
hmm.
or whatever. But it's very common for farms and ranches, at least where I was in, because where I grew up was a very small town. There wasn't a lot of industry there. If people were employed outside of farms and ranches, it was typically they worked for the Forest Service or the BLM, or like my mom worked for the post office, and that was it. And then the rest were just teeny local jobs, right? And so
Hmm.
it was not uncommon. Like my parents bought a farm and subdivided it, and they had, when I was a kid, they'd sold lots off the ground that they couldn't use for pasture or whatever as home sites, and they just carried the paperwork with it. So that's
Right.
extremely common. So I was
Hmm.
exposed to that very young, but I didn't know anything about it really as far as how it operated.
Right.
And I had heard other people, especially, like the late night um, infomercials that you would see back in the 2000s, especially prior to the friggin' meltdown in 2008 and on. The
Yeah.
GFC sort of put an end to it, but I saw all sorts of those no zero money down creative financing type things. Well, that's one form of the notes, but what kind of happened after 2008, which I later learned through a mentor that I had hooked up with, there was a tremendous amount of deal flow that happens in the banking system for financing homes. Everybody can think about like the mortgage companies will originate a loan, or the big banks will originate a loan, and the loans are sold between those mortgage brokers. They'll take a small fee for originating the loan, and then they'll immediately sell that loan to the big banks. The big
Hmm.
banks will hold on to them as long as they're performing. What happened in 2008 is they got this giant pile of non-performing notes or loans, and they would hold on to them until they couldn't anymore. And then when banks started having difficulties, they had to liquidate those on the secondary market because they had to get them off. The regulators forced them to get those loans off their
Off their
books.
books. Right.
That's right. And so their balance sheets, that's all about their stock price. And we could talk about, how the Fed works and all that for another day. But really
Yeah.
what happens in business, in the banking business, is that a loan is designed, if it works perfect, which is what everybody thought prior to the GFC, that somebody pays their mortgage loan, they never turn it over, they never let it go back to the bank, and they just collect the payments for the 30 years or 20 years or however long it's financed. But
Right.
when loans became delinquent, they started selling. And now prior to that, a whole bunch of people would buy and sell these little seller finance notes. But what's happened since that meltdown is that half the loans that are available in the secondary market, they no longer go to just other banks. They go to other banks, they go to the brokers that still do the mortgage-backed securities, where they'll take 10,000 loans that they'll buy off of Freddie Mac or Fannie Mae, or they'll buy from Bank of America or Wells Fargo or any of the big banks that have these loans. They'll put them all together and they'll treat it just like it's a separate security, and it's just nothing more than another business on the stock market. And it works exactly like a REIT or a real estate investment trust, right? It's just,
Hmm.
you pay for it as stock, they get their returns. At the end of it, if the price of the stock has gone up, you sell, you get your money back. That's what an
Hmm.
MBS is. It's super simple. But what's happened is that people that have been involved in the seller financing world have been able to get their foot in the door. Now, not the small guys. The small guys still have to wait in line, but another group of people have been able to buy. So instead of buying 10,000 loans from Fannie and Freddie, they'll buy 1,000 loans from the hedge funds and the MBS, the mortgage-backed securities that are run by the banks or their bank entities, separate entities that not quite a bank. They'll buy those smaller lots and then they'll sell those loans off piece by piece. Now, there's places online that you can buy them, but what's really kind of grown out of that, especially through the mentorship program I went through, it's the same one as the guys at PaperStack, that
Yeah.
there's this community of real estate loan investors where people will buy, a bigger shop will buy 1,000 or even 500 of these loans. They'll keep the 400 best or even the 100 best and then sell the rest off to the secondary market. And then the next smaller guy might buy 50. And then the guys like me who had some money from selling a single duplex, I took a single duplex that I made, let's just say 100,000 because I'll make the math easy. I went out and bought three $30,000 loans that had each of them. I bought them at a discount because these are notes that had to be rehabbed. They were modifications that people were going under and they were almost foreclosed on. They were totally blemished paper.
Right.
But
So
we
you're
bought
getting
them
it pennies on the
at a
dollar,
discount. That's
essentially.
right.
Yeah.
I paid like 70 cents on the dollar just so it's easy. I paid
Right.
70 cents on the dollar. So I've got a note. I paid 30,000 for it that's got an unpaid balance of 35,000. But because the original payment or the original loan was 100,000, the payment's like $500 a month.
Right.
And so then I'm using, and the other thing a lot of people don't know about is that most of the banks, they don't do the loan servicing. They hire third parties to do it.
Right.
And it's just a third party contractor that sends out the mail. It looks like it's from Wells Fargo, but it's actually not. That's why you see the bank address will be different than the national bank because it's the address of the third party servicer. Well, you as an individual business owner or business note owner, you can use those same third party. And so you have the benefit of using big bank infrastructure without any additional cost for technology stack or any of that. And you just kick them a small fee, like $50, maybe $80 a month, depending on the balance or the type of loan. Like if it's under duress or they need to foreclose on it, and they'll do all the loan collection. They'll be compliant with all the regulation around lending. And you just have to manage them and tell them when to pursue a borrower or when not to, or when to contact them if they haven't paid.
Interesting.
But
So they deal with all that.
they do.
And
Yeah.
that you pay that fee. Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, it's great because they can take care of all the compliance because every state has their own regulations around loan collection. Plus,
Right.
on top of that, there's federal regulation, and it's a mess if you were to try to do that as an individual. But you can just pay a third party contractor a little bit to do it, and they'll take care of all of that. And they just send you a report in their portal, and you just manage them. You become basically an asset manager as opposed to a property manager like I was before with my rentals.
Right. And yeah, so so your expenses essentially, instead of being um taxes, and I mean you're still gonna have taxes, I'm sure, but insurance and property managers and all that, your expense is just this paying this fee for this, basically to have access to what the banks have, and they take care of any loan defaults or anything like that.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's
That's cool.
fantastic.
So I've also heard, now, if it does go into default, do you essentially get to take over the property then? Because you own the loan on that property, or how does that work if they do end up defaulting and then this other company comes in and says and takes over handling that? What is the worst outcome, I guess, or I don't even know if that's a bad outcome.
Yeah.
Like if that
Well,
is an outcome.
there's a number of things that you can do that are interesting about being an individual. An
Mm,
individual investor gets to decide all these things.
mhm,
What happens in the process? You have to know the specifics of the parameters that you can work in, right? Those rails of what regulation and what the loan contract actually says in and of itself. But
mhm,
most of these loans, especially the bank loans, they're very standard. There's nothing fancy about any of the terms or conditions that the bank has to run them on, and you're just stepping into that same position as the bank, right?
Right.
What is interesting in buying these what they call scratch and dent loans or seller financed loans, either one, these are they're kind of they're kind of blemished. They're not perfect. They're not pristine, not from a paperwork standpoint, but from a payment history standpoint.
Right.
The banks are willing to let go of them because it costs them so much to deal with them. And they don't really want to do a foreclosure because a foreclosure costs them a time more than money. It's the time that they have to involve themselves into because
Right.
at scale, it's too expensive.
Yeah. They're just used to
That's right.
collect
That's right.
loan. Yeah.
And yep, and that's why they've outsourced all the collection to the third parties. And then once it reaches a certain threshold, then they really start letting these loans go in the secondary market, right? Because it's in their interest to get out of it. They don't want to deal with it. They have one trick:
Right.
collect the payment as designed or sell it. Sell the loan. That's what they want to do. They don't want to go through foreclosure. But what happens with those loans that come, and the same thing happens with private equity or hedge funds, they really are kind of bound, even though it's not regulatory based. Their incentive is to the same. It's scale. They don't want to deal with these bad loans. But an
Mm-hmm.
individual, you can buy them for cheaper. You get a bigger discount. They want to get rid of them, and they'll willingly accept that discount to get rid of the problem. But someone is like me, I've got a cushion in what's owed to me plus the interest.
Right.
I've already got some built-in incentive to keep the loan going. And in fact, I've done this myself a number of times. I have the flexibility to do a workout with the individual.
Right.
Sometimes that's just a forbearance that's informal. Sometimes it has to be papered up in order to kind of get you back in place. And you get to talk these things through with the servicer.
Mm-hmm.
I've managed a couple of times on 2 properties to be able to get someone back to a performing status after missing 3 or 4 payments in a row, not answering the phone, and just offering. Now, I don't do it, but I tell the servicer, get them to pay however you can legally, but know that if they I would rather take part of a payment than
Yeah.
and get
Here's
them
what I'm
used to
willing to
paying
do.
again, right?
Right. Yeah.
To get them
Mhm.
back into it. And the moment you do that, 9 times out of 10, the borrower goes, "Oh, okay, I'm not dealing with a terrible bank. I'm
Right.
dealing with a reasonable bank," and they'll
Like
step
a
forward.
human touch to it.
Yeah.
That's cool. Yeah.
If they don't, I don't wanna take their property. Like, that's the last thing I wanna do. So I
Yeah.
can offer a modification, or in the situation, because this happens, divorce or something happens in a family
Right.
that people just don't wanna be there emotionally, and it's
Yeah.
not about the money. We can do things like help them, encourage them to go sell it in the secondary market and be flexible on how you take the payment off, the payoff. I mean, that's complicated. It sounds complicated, but it's really simple because all you're doing is telling the servicers to that's what you want to
This is
do,
what
and
you're
they handle it.
willing to
They
do.
get their lawyers involved and they do it. Sometimes
Right.
they'll do a modification where they'll just say, "Okay, you're behind 7 months. We're just going to take that 7 months of payment and we're going to tack it on to the end of your current payment stack and not calculate any additional interest on it because you've got that wiggle room because of the discount." Worst case
Gotcha.
scenario, you get the property back. Like the person wants to walk away, they don't want it. So you've got this property back. It might even be totally demolished. But
Mm.
because I understand the paper well enough now, it actually turns into a good deal because then I can turn around and seller finance to another end buyer without going through a bank. I don't have to pay a realtor to lose any of those sorts of fees. I just have to pay to have the paper done up right. And I know what the qualifications are and the requirements are to be like Dodd-Frank compliant or any of the sort of truth in lending regulation that is around home mortgages. And I can take a seller finance loan and get it papered to where it looks like a bank loan. And I can take the money in as a down payment. I can say, hey, I'll sell this on private financing with a large down payment. And sometimes you can turn a crappy loan into a much better loan just by being able to get rid of the problem buyer and get the paperwork redone in a more advantageous way. And with seller financing, typically this is higher interest rate anyway. And it just seems that right now's current environment is actually just 8% is normal in seller finance world.
Right.
That's
Yeah.
not uncommon at all. And I have a couple of loans that are at their face rate is 10%. So
Wow.
it's not outside of the realm of expectation. And the other caveat is that there's a lot of there's something like 20 million homes in America that are valued under 200,000. And because of all the regulations that come with establishing a bank loan, the costs are so high that most of the banks, irregardless of current interest rate environment, they won't lend on anything below 175,000, primarily because they lose money.
Mm-hmm.
Anything below that, they can't charge enough on their fees to make up
Right.
for it, so they don't even lend. And there's entire states that have the vast majority of their housing is under that.
Right.
Like the Midwest is completely filled with totally normal, great homes that in California would be worth 700,000, but because they're in Indiana or Ohio, out in the rural areas, they're, you know, 65,000,
115. Yeah.
115,000. Right.
Yeah.
It's absolutely bonkers. And that's hard for people that aren't used to looking at property outside of the 30 miles they can drive to every day.
Right. Yep. Yeah. I think a lot of people don't quite get that there are still places like that that have nice houses for that
Yeah.
price.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's mind blowing. It's mind blowing.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. Um, there's, I know you have so many um, projects going on right now. This is just one tiny slice of what you do. Um, but as far as I think I might want to just move on to the next topic, even though I really want to dive into this even more. So if there are people that want to hear more about this, please let me know in the comments, because I definitely do, and I want to know if there's more interest on this. But to get to Kevin's got so many things going on. I did want to talk about shiny object syndrome, because this is something both you and I have, and I think you have it even more. It's got to be, because you have so many things going on. But what shiny object syndrome is that an opportunity comes in and you start, oh, I want to work on that, and then you go dive on that, and then another one comes up, and then, oh, I want to be part of that too, and you dive onto that, and so you're constantly sort of, you start spreading yourself thin. And what are your thoughts on how you're trying to manage that now, because you do have a lot going on? I know you have your spouse is into all the stuff that you're doing as well, and so that definitely splits the load in some cases. But what are your thoughts on trying to mitigate that? Because I think a
It
lot of
is
people
a
fall into that.
daily challenge.
Yeah.
to rein yourself in and not get super excited, especially if like one of the things that is very interesting to me and why I ended up even at Tom Woods is that there's a tremendous amount of intellectual research that goes into people's interests, right? And that there are things that are totally fascinating to us. And it doesn't matter if it's religion or business or some hobby that you have, there's something that gets your interest up about something. And I think for me, I am always been the type that likes to do things, and I like to do really interesting, cool things. And that's how I ended up in the guard. I had never contemplated learning to fly when I was a kid. I grew up in this small town where I'd seen a few helicopters and fixed wing aircraft, right? That wasn't, I mean, I was interested in it.
Hmm.
I really was, but it was always going to just be a hobby. And then I found out an opportunity to go into after I finished college the first time, I ended up deciding, hey, that's a great opportunity to go fly. And I literally within a week of learning I could do that, I had joined the
Hmm.
guard.
Hmm.
I mean, no exaggeration. It was 7 days
Wow, that
from
looks
when I
cool.
talked to the recruiter to when I
Dive in.
was at MEPS swearing
Wow.
my oath as an enlisted guy.
Wow.
And then it took me about a year and a half to get selected for the flight school program.
Right.
Like that was a slog, but it was worth every second of it. It was the most rewarding thing I'd ever done to that point in my life. And um, that becomes addicting. And I think
Hmm.
when you have success, even if it's on accident, there's something about that will continue to sort of grab your attention. And whenever you see something, at least this is what my problem has been, whenever I see something that looks even remotely intellectually interesting, and it's probably the same reason that algorithms that YouTube and Twitter and TikTok
Right.
and all those things work on us rats that love to click that button. There's some sort of trigger inside of us, whether it's dopamine or whatever scientific name you can give it. There's a draw there, and I have to continually fight that. One of the things that's helped mitigate that is the fact that we've got a bunch of small kids around the house, and they're always busy. So you kind of sort of get to temper some of those things. But my wife is probably the coolest person I've ever met, and she's brought out the best in me. And every time we've interacted with something that's new, and we tend to be attracted to the same sorts of things, and so
Mm.
that has helped us propel ourselves to sort of more productive things. But there was a time where when I was by myself, I would read 100 books about a subject, or I would watch 100 videos about a subject, and it wouldn't really account to anything other than it would be mildly interesting. And for some reason, now we've found each other and found this opportunity at different turns and different businesses to sort of strike at our own natural instincts
Hmm.
and kind of scratch that itch of wanting to do something interesting that's not the normal day-to-day stuff that most people find drudgery in. Because I've been in corporate gig since I left the military, and there have been times where it was the most boring thing on earth, but I could find a way around it because I had these other things to do it. And so that's
Right.
to say, like, those those interests can overwhelm me pretty quickly.
Hmm.
And I think only because of my wife being able to temper that and have a different perspective that I can actually listen to, that I think has helped me personally get better at it. But man, if it was not for her, I don't know. I really don't know what kind of trouble I would be in at this point in my life.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think also I've noticed, like we were just talking earlier about, and why don't I just bring it up? You've got this website here that you also have something similar. So you're kind of consolidating ideas. So you've got this idea, but now you're like, how can I bring these two together in sort of the same world so that you're kind of going after one goal? I think that also helps the shiny object if you can start consolidating and bringing. That's what I'm doing right now in my all the shiny objects I've got going on. Is I had to like list them all and go, how can I tie these together and start bringing these together into one focus instead of two separate or five separate focuses? And I know you've got a food business and this business as well. um, was that part of that process of trying to bring two ideas into one, or was one spawned off on the other? How did that work?
So the food and meat co-op, that started as a request. My wife was looking to actually become a customer
Mm,
of a group buy organization in Utah. It was
hmm.
4 or 5 hours away. They were talking about expanding to Idaho, but couldn't get anybody to run it. And my wife kept bugging him, please come up here, please come up here. And their founder said, hey, you're the most annoying customer we have. Why don't you run it? And
Right,
we'll work with you.
right.
And so really all we do is it's a bunch of people get together. We take orders through a little Shopify store and figure out the items that we can source from a couple of local distributors in Utah. And some of those products, like some of the meats and some of the frozen goods, are actually produced either in Idaho or in Utah or some closer surrounding states. And we just take the orders, place a big order, kind of get a discount, a group buy discount, so we're kind of sitting in between that artisanal farm that's got the super organic chicken that's $90 a pound or whatever it is,
Hmm.
to your normal store that's charging $10 a chicken or whatever it is, right?
Yeah.
I'm just using chicken as the example, as one of the products we sell. So we can buy it this way because we don't buy like a single chicken. We buy a box of 40 pounds of chicken breast, a 40-pound box of chicken thighs, or a 40-pound box of ground beef. Or,
Hmm.
we've got some local farmers that actually have beef shares that they'll cut into 16ths or 18 an eighth or a quarter of a cattle. That is a mixed bag of steaks and roasts and what have you, right? And they pick the products, and then we just sort of facilitate that move from there from the farms to local customers. And we kind of just balanced out between super good prices below the grocery store and almost fresh, almost organic when we can between the artisanal stores. And so we reach a very small footprint. It's a lot of work. There's a lot of marketing that's involved. Most of the logistics comes out of Utah. We're just doing marketing up here. But as time has gone on, we've learned a bunch about it. We've been doing it for, gosh, like 8 months, I think. We just had
Mm-hmm.
our latest order filled on this last Saturday. And so along the way, we just started talking to my wife. Was like, all my friends, they do homesteading stuff at home. It's either canning or it's our own foods that are not canned or processed, but homemade bread. Like my wife makes all the bread that we consume in our house now is made. I can't eat food at restaurants or grocery stores anymore for the most part, unless it's
You're
like
getting
whole
everything from
vegetables.
scratch, and yeah.
My wife is amazing. She can do some phenomenal things with just a little bit of ingredients, and she absolutely adores cooking. And she's like, "What's the one thing I talk about all the time?" I'm like, cooking and all these things that you can do. And so we combined what we learned with the food and meat co-op, and we started this brainstorming different ideas. And she found a contractor that's helped put the website together and help her source some US producers of some of the different products. And so there's some mix and match, like some grain mills and some meat grinders and some different items that would help you do some homesteading or homesteading type activities at home. And now, I mean, this conversation that we had about doing this has been going on for maybe 3 or 4 weeks. And
Mm-hmm.
we just got this website handed over to us today. And
Nice.
we're going to be turning it on just in a couple of days, open to the public on a full launch.
Amazing. Very cool. So it's really one's kind of spawned off into another thing, and they kind of just happen to coincide, where you've got the food
Yeah.
business and now this sort of accessory business to homestead.
Yeah.
I guess. Yeah.
I think that's a great way of putting it.
And are you going to be doing some sort of blogging of homesteading as well along with it? Is that the idea, or how? Or
Yeah, I think one of the things we were talking about with the food and meat co-op was sort
mhm.
of, do we write a small short book, or do we have just some blogs? And part of my military experience, I became a contributing author on a book, I
Oh,
Love
nice.
America, with Mike Capuzzi.
Very
He's the
cool.
main author. He's the publisher. Myself and some other veterans, we wrote a book. We wrote chapters about different experiences and what we think America needs going forward. And that project was last fall for me, taught me that maybe we should write a book. And so one of the things that we've done, we've outlined a whole series of blog posts and some content with the idea of that process of creating that will just flow over, and then we'll probably release a book at some point that will be kind of a mix of encouragement to people and some how-tos on some of the products
The
that we
products that you
have and
sell.
some of the
Right.
products that we would like to get, and sort of see if that. And these are small books, they're a couple, like 110 pages. They're not extremely difficult, but they're actually more useful, and people tend to pick these up and read them more. And so
Right.
I think that's one of the things we're going to do pretty early in the process. But that timeline, who knows? We got to get the website up and turning in a little bit of revenue before we can start to
Move on to
pursue
that
that
part.
fully. Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. Very cool. Well, so these are just a few of the things. You're helicopter pilot, you're real estate, mortgage note lender, homesteading, food service. Like this is just scratching the surface of, and writer, book writer, author. So we're just scratching the surface of everything that Kevin does. The one thing that we haven't talked about is, and I know we've gone longer than most of my podcasts are normally like 30 minutes, but there's so much here. I'm really curious to see what portions of this podcast people are interested in, so we can dive a little bit more into one of the topics, if not all, in future podcasts. But I'm wondering if when you went and had first, what made you decide to go to this Oren Klaff? Was it a seminar or?
Oh yeah.
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 For
Or
anybody who doesn't know, Kevin's the one that inspired me to buy this book. Oren Klaff is the one that wrote this book, Pitch Anything. Um, what was it that inspired you, and is that sort of the glue to all of these other things where you're trying is it the marketing piece, is it pitching, is it what is that, what spawned that idea? And I know you came back from that experience super excited, and you're still going through things with Oren.
Well, okay, so that's a great story. I'll try to my very best to condense it down.
Oh,
But
good.
the accountability group that you and I met in,
Yeah.
I had been a member of that some months prior,
Yeah.
and I joined it primarily because I was trying to figure out how to shape my message of looking for outside capital for buying more real estate notes. Because
Mm.
I'm doing very well with it in my own portfolio, but I was having difficulty in communicating that with other individuals
Mm-hmm.
and getting people to be interested in the topic if they'd never heard of it before. And I thought there was a whole bunch of things that I needed to do that were completely wrong. And it was discussing it with our accountability group leader, that Jeremy, who had said, pitch anything, Oren Claff is the best ever, blah, 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 blah. I said, I've never heard of this. And that was in late February of this year.
Mm-hmm.
I picked up Pitch Anything. I read it in a week. Oren had a new book. I checked out his website. He had a new book. Flip the Script. I read that in a couple of nights and was instantly hooked. I joined his newsletter, and he every Friday at that time had a webinar where he was discussing a coaching program that he had to teach CEOs and business owners who had existing businesses how to raise capital. And it was very plainly obvious to me that he was looking for individuals that have businesses with significant revenue, not because that's the target he was really after, but because that typically brings with it a level of sophistication. And most of the people that he has are very highly experienced MBAs and 20-year veterans of whatever industry they were in. But I was completely fascinated with it, and I started going to those webinars. I think it was like on the third one, he announced an in-person event in California at his headquarters in Carlsbad. He was going to take an application of 15 people to see who would go. I threw in an application. He called me like maybe the next day and just started chatting with me to kind of make sure that I was serious, because he said, you are completely outside the realm of what we have, but I did notes in 2012 for a very short period of time. You're the first person that's brought notes back to our facility.
Mm.
I'm going to let you in. And I went down there, and everybody that was there, I had no business being there. I had zero experience at the level that these guys. There was a guy there buying a bank in Florida. There was
Wow.
another guy that was looking at buying a business and needed to raise $115 million just to buy this other business to go along with the one he was already on. And it was just going to be a 10% increase in his bottom line. Like,
Wow.
it was completely fascinating to me, this group of people that we were working with. Immediately after that, I joined a coaching program that Oren had for the next, what was to be 90 days, to teach how to walk through all the things you need to pitch a business when you're trying to raise capital under a security, which I had no expectation of. I wasn't even looking for that. And I spent a lot of times in the book. I had to cut back on the business accountability group for it. And anyway, I spent every week, I was going to these classes. I was completely overwhelmed for a large period of that time, but I just kept at it and kept at it. And it finally started to click. Along the way, Oren had been working on another deal that he was looking to start a manufacturing facility in the United States that would be unique. It was a reshoring exercise out of trying to bring some processes that have been done in China for the last decade and some processes that are in Europe and bring them to the United States and make it a domestic supply chain that's not going to be susceptible to interruptions. And that process, I learned a tremendous amount about how a pitch goes together for raising those kinds of funds.
Mm-hmm.
And they have a whole longer plan. I won't go into it here, but Oren then he decided that he was going to discontinue his coaching program. And I was pretty crushed, but he decided to revamp it and include it as part of an investing community, and to get people to come into his facility and become more of a core group of investors that can source bigger and larger deals. And he invited me to come along because he saw how hard I was working, even though, again, I have no business being there. as from an experience standpoint, but because of the fact that my relationship kind of built out of hanging out with him and participating in his training, and I have come so far ahead of where I once was in understanding how a pitch goes together, how businesses function, at least from a financial standpoint, that it's hard to describe in a short period of time
Mm-hmm.
how much different my outlook is. But I do know that I could never go back. And so I've been this sort of voracious reader of all things financial. I've read a couple of other books on how to do financial modeling and to put um, your numbers together in order to persuade or at least show people that you know what you're doing with your business, but you also know how you can bring investors in and establish a sort of program that makes you more serious from just being a startup to actually being a business that people would like to invest in long term.
Mm-hmm.
And
So,
that program, just the first in-person event just ended just a couple of days ago, and it was down in
okay,
California as well.
awesome. And so your goal with this is to take some of, probably, I'm assuming, not just your mortgage notes, which was originally what you went in for, but all of these businesses you have to a certain
Yes.
level and be able to start raising capital for them to grow them even bigger. I assume that's the goal.
100%.
Yeah. Awesome.
I've in fact since then I've also got another business. I'm under an NDA on a purchase and sale agreement to buy a local manufacturing business from someone who is retiring, and I used everything I learned from Oren to not only craft my discussion with the seller, but to
Mm,
also look for future steps that I can set this purchase up to a point where I can bring on additional investors to grow it from just a small business that has potential to actually become a larger business, and then probably take on some employees in the next probably 4 to 6 months.
wow.
And I would not
Awesome.
have been able to do that without Oren's advice.
Right. Right. Yeah, that sounds amazing. And I remember when you came back from that, that was the first day I met you, and you were
Yeah.
just so jazzed about it. And ever since then, every time I mean, we just had an accountability meeting earlier today, and you always bring this energy, like, of all the stuff you're doing, and it's very inspiring. And I'm sure my audience here will be super inspired, and I can't wait to hear some of the comments from people, to hear what they're more interested about, because this is obviously a lot of different stuff than what we normally talk about, and hopefully opens people's minds up to newer, better things that are possible out there. So it's great talking to you about all of this. And I know we're running long, and I don't want to keep you because I know you just did another podcast before this. So I want to be mindful of your time as well. How I normally end these is I always say, what's the favorite film that you worked on? But I want to either say what's your favorite film of all time, or specific genre, and if you have a specific genre of horror films, romantic comedies, or whatever they may be, whatever genre, I am sure it's the romantic comedy. What's your favorite film in that specific genre?
Man. Okay. So this one's hard. Not because I can't answer it, but because I have too many answers.
All
Because
right.
I absolutely love entertainment and the ability to exit the real world and go into some other universe that's not real, or an imagined alternative to the one we're in. And for
Right.
whatever reason, I think that's universal. For me, like when we first started talking about this, the horror film, I don't like horror films. I can't stand them for the most part, except the most influential film I ever saw as a kid was John Carpenter's The Thing. And
Right.
after we talked about it, I've watched it twice in the last week
Have you?
at different times, just because I forgot I hadn't seen it in a long time, and I forgot how interesting and in some ways some of the effects they don't hold up nearly as well, but there's
There's
something
something
about that
about that time
film.
period
I
too
I
that,
just
yeah.
I absolutely adore that film. It looks spectacular. There's a lot of hidden details in it. It's just plain fun on top of being an intellectual horror film. I think that was
I'm glad you brought it up because I haven't watched that in ages, and
yeah.
so I'm gonna add it into my October lineup when I do my horror film month because that's all I watch during, or not horror films, but Halloween type movies.
Yeah.
And I'm definitely adding that to my list this next coming year. In fact, I'd probably watch it now.
Yeah, man.
Before then.
I bet it'd been probably 4 or 5 years since I'd seen it. I had to watch as soon as I wrote the notes down when you asked me when we were prepping for
Yeah,
this. I was like, oh my gosh, I have to watch that again. And I watched it and I'm like, that was so bad in some ways and so awesome in others. I have to watch it again. And the
that's
fact
great.
that the main hero is a helicopter pilot makes it all that much cooler to
Of
me.
course. Yeah,
So that was
absolutely.
fun. And
Very cool.
and I think what I also like about it is it's probably one of the more enjoyable, ambiguous endings in any film I've ever seen.
Yeah,
Most of the time, it's either you're like, "What the hell? This is great," or "What the hell? I don't understand." To one that is like that perfect balance. I think that's a great film for that reason.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Um, you had some other ones in your notes, and I had to go because I hadn't seen the Raiders of the Lost Ark, the Soderbergh
Yeah,
version. I'd never seen that, and so
yeah,
I looked it up, and the the you never think of Indiana Jones as sort of a black and white. If you
oh,
see it in black and
yeah.
white, it's brilliant. Like you go through it, and it's like this should have been a black and white film. It's so good.
I think very few films have ever been blocked as well as that one and set up. And I read recently that I can't his name escapes me, but the DP on that film came from the old black and white era. He was
Right?
old when
Yeah,
they
yeah.
did that film, and so that was his medium. Like he shot that color film as though it was black and white, and it has
Right,
such phenomenal contrast and God, it's just spectacular. And there's so much going on in every single frame.
right,
And I enjoyed it. And I remember watching that when I was younger, thinking, this movie is fun, but there's something else about it, and I don't understand why. And it was after I discovered Soderbergh's little experiment of it that he takes it black and white and then puts 9 inch nails underneath, and there's no dialogue, and all you see is the visuals. And I was stunned at how riveting I found it the first time. And I've watched that probably 7 or 8 times. And I started it again in between viewings of The Thing.
that's amazing. Well, you are definitely a true movie buff with that suggestion. That it is brilliant, though. I hadn't seen it. What I had seen was the guys that had recreated Raiders of the Lost Ark when
Mm.
they were like younger. I don't know if you saw that documentary
I've
on
seen parts of it. Yeah, I've seen
yeah,
highlights. I love that. I need to look that up again.
it's crazy. And then later on, they did the only shot they didn't film back then was that huge, plane that funky looking plane in that the Nazis had,
Yeah.
and then they shot it later in life to do this documentary, which is pretty cool. But yeah, that Soderbergh version is amazing. And the interesting thing is, I didn't realize, even going through film school, that black and white wasn't just a DSAT. Because I think, oh, if I want a black and white anything, I'll just do a quick desaturation on the image, and now I've got black and white. A lighter
Mhm.
showed me that no, it's not that simple. Like
Yeah.
every color has its own version of grayscale in it, and you really see that in this version. I definitely recommend checking it out. In fact, I'll put a link in the comments to check this out.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Um, so thanks for bringing that up. I wanted to bring up one more website of yours, kevin-stokes.com. Why don't you tell us about that as well?
Yeah, well, I found, after discussing some stuff with my wife that we have all these pans in the fire and it's getting hard to run down. And every time I get a chance to tell people. And so we decided that we would start our own individual websites and then just have our own little link tree on it. So this is a new website. We're just standing it up today. I can't get Kevin without the dash. That's a guy in
That's where
California.
I ended
He's
up with.
retired, and I can't find him.
That's where I ended up with money-act.com. It's like,
Yep.
yep.
I just can't get a hold of him. So I don't know. We'll see. At some point, I'll just run with it, and I'll be Kevin Stokes from now on, I guess.
There you go. Awesome. Well, definitely check that out. And again, I'm going to bring up your other website, thehappyhomesteader.com, to find out more about Kevin and what he's doing. Thank you so much for being here, Kevin. It was, I hope a lot of people will put comments in on what aspect, or if all of them, they want to explore more, because every time I talk to you, I get jazzed up about anything business, entrepreneurship. Definitely inspiring guy. And I love that you have the film passion as well. It just kind of ties everything in. But thanks so much for coming on the show. Oh, and also for those who haven't been to my website, definitely go to money-act.com. I've got the dash too, as mentioned, and you can find a little bit more about me and my business, where we talk about movies and money. Again, thanks so much, Kevin, for being on the show.
Hey, it's my pleasure, Ryan.
All right. Take care.
You too. We'll see you.